In Geneva, one racist insult from Trump shook the world, but Ibrahim Traoré's calm response turned humiliation into Africa's greatest moment of dignity. The morning mist clung to Lake Geneva as private jets descended one after another onto the pristine tarmac. Inside the opulent Pale Dion, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, where the world's most powerful leaders would soon gather. The air was thick with anticipation and the subtle tension that always preceded meetings between old colonial powers and the new generation of African leadership. Security personnel moved like ghosts through corridors lined with portraits of forgotten diplomats. Outside, Swiss guards stood at attention while protesters' distant chants echoed across the lake. This was no ordinary economic forum. This was the stage where Africa's future would be negotiated. Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of his modest delegation vehicle. His simple military uniform, a stark contrast to the designer suit surrounding him. At 34, he was the youngest leader in the room, yet his eyes carried the weight of centuries of struggle. The whispers followed him as he walked through the grand entrance. Some dismissive, others curious about this soldier president who had dared to challenge France's grip on West Africa. His delegation was small but dignified, each member carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing left to lose. The marble echoed with their footsteps as they moved toward the main conference hall. Behind them, the weight of an entire continent's hopes pressed forward like an invisible tide. The main conference hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of international diplomacy. Translators tested their equipment while camera crews positioned themselves for the perfect shot of what everyone knew would be a historic encounter. The seating arrangement had been debated for weeks. Where to place the young revolutionary among the established order of global power? French President Macron exchanged knowing glances with his European counterparts, their expressions betraying their discomfort with Africa's new defiance. Chinese delegates observed silently from their corner, calculating opportunities in the brewing tensions. At the center of it all, an empty chair waited for the American president, whose reputation for unpredictable diplomacy had everyone on edge. As the session was called to order, every eye in the room turned toward the door where Donald Trump would soon enter. The fate of millions of Africans hung in the balance of conversations that would unfold in this sterile palace of power. Traore sat calmly, his hands folded, knowing that his very presence here represented a seismic shift in the continental power dynamics. The old colonial agreements were crumbling, and everyone in this room knew it. The question was not whether change would come, but how violently the established order would resist it. In this moment of perfect tension, history held its breath. The bilateral meeting room felt suffocating despite its grandeur, with only a handful of advisors witnessing what would become one of diplomacy's most shocking moments. Trump had entered with his characteristic swagger, immediately taking control of the conversation about trade agreements and military cooperation. His voice grew louder as Traore calmly outlined Burkina Faso's new sovereignty initiatives, rejecting the traditional aid dependency model that had enslaved Africa for decades. The American president's face wrinkled as he realized this young African leader wasn't going to bow to Western pressure like his predecessors. Tension crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The translators exchanged nervous glances, sensing the diplomatic disaster about to unfold. You people need to understand your place in the world. Trump's voice cut through the diplomatic pleasantries like a blade. His advisors shifted uncomfortably as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the kind of contempt that had defined centuries of colonial attitudes. The words that followed would be replayed millions of times across every continent. Maybe you should go back to the zoo where you belong. The room fell into a deathly silence, the kind that follows a gunshot in a crowded theater. Even his own staff looked horrified, knowing immediately that this moment would define his presidency's relationship with an entire continent. The recording devices captured every syllable of the statement that would ignite a global firestorm. Traore's expression remained unchanged, his dark eyes steady, as he absorbed the full weight of the insult. His advisors tensed, ready to storm out, but their leader raised a subtle hand to keep them seated. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, each second amplifying the magnitude of what had just occurred. Trump seemed to realize the gravity of his words, his bravado wavering as he met Traore's unwavering gaze. The American delegation sat frozen, understanding that this single moment had just shattered years of diplomatic progress. History pivoted on the edge of Traore's response. Within minutes, the audio leaked through diplomatic channels, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms and international news networks. The phrase, "Go back to the zoo," began trending globally as millions of people processed the shocking display of racial contempt from a sitting American president. African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa erupted in emergency sessions, while protesters gathered outside American embassies across the continent. The insult had been heard around the world, but now everyone waited to see how the young leader would respond. The next few hours would determine whether this moment would destroy diplomatic relations or become the catalyst for Africa's final break from Western dominance. The world held its breath. The silence in the room stretched like a taut wire. Every breath amplified in the diplomatic tension that followed Trump's devastating insult. Traore's advisors watched their leader face, expecting the explosion of anger that any reasonable person would display after such humiliation. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary. A man drawing strength from the very depths of his ancestors' resilience. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, as if the words had simply bounced off an invisible shield forged by centuries of African dignity. The American delegation fidgeted nervously, recognizing that they were witnessing either complete shock or something far more dangerous. Trump himself seemed confused by the lack of reaction, his expectation of chaos met with an unsettling calm. When Traore finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of quiet authority that had led him through 2 successful coups and countless battles. "Mr. President," he began, his English crisp and measured. "Your words reveal more about your character than they ever could about mine." The simplicity of the statement hit like a precision strike, dismantling the intended humiliation with surgical elegance. His advisors exchanged glances of admiration while the Americans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was no anger in his tone, no defensive posturing, just the unshakable confidence of a man who knew his worth. The philosophical depth of his response began to dawn on everyone present as they realized they were witnessing a masterclass in dignity. "In my country, we have a saying," Traore continued, his hands still folded calmly on the polished table. "The lion does not concern himself with the opinions of sheep, but I am not even a lion. I am simply a servant of my people." His words carried the accumulated wisdom of African philosophy, transforming the attempted degradation into a moment of profound teaching. The American president's face darkened as he realized his verbal assault had not only failed, but had been turned into a demonstration of superior character. Even the translators seemed moved by the grace with which Traore had absorbed and redirected the attack. The room felt the shift in power dynamics as moral authority transferred from the world's most powerful office to a young African revolutionary. The response that followed would be analyzed by diplomats and philosophers for generations to come. "Your zoo comment suggests you see Africans as animals to be caged and displayed for your entertainment," Traore said, his voice never rising above conversational level. "But history will remember that in this room, It was you who behaved like a beast while I chose to remain human." The words landed with devastating precision, each syllable calculated to expose the moral bankruptcy of colonial thinking. His calm delivery made the critique even more powerful, demonstrating that true strength didn't require volume or aggression. As the meeting concluded in stunned silence, everyone present knew they had witnessed a defining moment in international relations. The weight of 500 years of colonial oppression seemed to flow through Traore's words as he continued his measured response to the American president's insult. His voice carried the echoes of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had taught Burkina Faso that dignity was not negotiable. "Mr. President, you speak of zoos, but it is your policies that have caged entire nations in debt and dependency," he said, his tone never wavering from its calm authority. The historical context was unmistakable. This was not just one man defending himself, but the voice of a continent finally speaking its truth. His advisors sat transfixed, realizing they were witnessing their leader channel the accumulated wisdom of African resistance movements. The American delegation could only watch as their crude insult was transformed into a history lesson. "My grandfather fought French colonizers with his bare hands, so that I could sit in this room as an equal," Traore continued, his dark eyes fixed on Trump's increasingly uncomfortable face. "Your words today prove that the colonial mindset still infects the highest offices of Western power." The reference to his family's revolutionary legacy added personal weight to his diplomatic response, connecting his individual struggle to the broader African liberation narrative. His calm delivery made each word strike like a precision missile, dismantling decades of Western superiority complex with surgical eloquence. The room felt the shift as moral authority passed from the world's most powerful office to a young African leader. Even the Swiss mediators seemed moved by the profound dignity of his response. "True leadership is not measured by the size of one's military or the depth of one's treasury," Traore said, his hands still folded peacefully on the polished conference table. "It is measured by one's capacity to lift up the human spirit in the face of deliberate degradation." His words carried the philosophical depth that had made him beloved among African youth, who saw him as the embodiment of their continental aspirations. The American president's crude insult had unwittingly provided the perfect platform for Traore to articulate his vision of dignified resistance. His response demonstrated that intellectual and moral superiority could not be bought or bullied into submission. The global audience watching through leaked audio would soon understand they were hearing the voice of Africa's future. "I came here to discuss partnerships between equals, not to be reminded of your ancestors' view of mine," Traore concluded, his voice carrying a finality that signaled the end of an era. His words captured the essence of what the new Africa represented. A continent done with begging for respect and ready to command it through dignified action. The meeting room fell silent as everyone processed the historical significance of what they had just witnessed. Trump's attempt to humiliate had backfired spectacularly, creating instead a moment of African triumph that would inspire millions. The young leader's response had turned a diplomatic disaster into a declaration of independence from Western condescension. History would remember this as the moment when Africa stopped asking for a seat at the table and started building its own. Within 30 minutes of the leaked audio hitting social media, one zoo comment was trending globally across every platform, with millions of users sharing their shock and outrage. CNN broke into regular programming with breaking news. Trump's racist remark to African leader sparks international crisis, scrolling across screens worldwide. The BBC World Service interrupted its regular broadcast to analyze what correspondents were calling the most diplomatically damaging statement in modern American history. Al Jazeera's African bureau exploded with activity as reporters scrambled to capture reactions from every corner of the continent. French media outlets caught between their colonial past and diplomatic future struggled to find appropriate coverage angles. The audio clip spread faster than any political scandal in recent memory, reaching an estimated 100 million people within the first hour. European leaders began distancing themselves from the American position before their own citizens could demand explanations. German Chancellor's office issued a statement calling the remarks deeply inappropriate and contrary to our shared values of human dignity. The British Prime Minister's spokesperson announced an emergency review of the special relationship with Washington, while Swedish and Norwegian officials openly condemn the racist language. Even traditional American allies, like Canada and Australia, issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about the diplomatic breakdown. The European Union called an emergency session to address what they termed a crisis of Western diplomatic credibility. A NATO headquarters buzzed with activity as military officials worried about the alliance's future stability in the face of such moral bankruptcy. African social media exploded with pride and admiration for their young leader's dignified response to the American president's crude insults. Traore's response began trending alongside Duhazu's comment, with millions sharing clips of his calm, measured words that had turned humiliation into triumph. University students across the continent organized spontaneous rallies, chanting Traore quotes about dignity and servant leadership. The African Union's headquarters received thousands of messages of support for what people were calling the speech that changed everything. Even traditionally pro-Western African leaders found themselves forced to publicly support Traore's position or risk losing credibility with their own people. The response from the diaspora was equally powerful, with African communities worldwide organizing protests outside American embassies and consulates. International relations experts scrambled to analyze what many were calling a watershed moment in global diplomacy. Harvard's Kennedy School announced an emergency symposium on the end of Western diplomatic hegemony, while Oxford's African Studies Department prepared a comprehensive analysis of the incident's long-term implications. The United Nations Secretary-General called for calm, while privately expressing concern about the potential for lasting damage to international cooperation. Chinese state media, sensing opportunity, began highlighting the incident as evidence of Western hypocrisy and moral decline. The global conversation had shifted from Trump's insult to Traore's response, with commentators worldwide praising the African leader's philosophical approach to diplomatic confrontation. The transformation began in the universities of Accra, where thousands of students gathered in spontaneous assemblies chanting Traore's words about dignity and servant leadership. Social media campaigns erupted across the continent, with African dignity and servant leadership becoming rallying cries for a generation tired of Western condescension. Street artists in Lagos painted murals of Traore's calm face alongside quotes from his legendary response, turning urban walls into galleries of resistance. Young professionals in Nairobi organized flash mobs reciting his speech, their voices echoing through business districts where colonial-era statues still cast shadows. The movement spread like wildfire through WhatsApp groups and TikTok videos, with African youth finding their voice in their leader's measured words. What had begun as an insult had become the catalyst for the continent's most powerful unity movement in decades. Messages of support poured in from unexpected corners of the globe, including prominent African American leaders who saw parallels to their own struggles for dignity. NBA star LeBron James tweeted Traore's quote about lions and sheep to his 50 million followers, amplifying the message beyond diplomatic circles. Hollywood celebrities with African heritage began sharing the audio clip, praising the young leader's masterclass in grace under pressure. Even some European intellectuals acknowledged the moral superiority of Traoré's response, with French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy calling it a moment of philosophical triumph over crude power. The incident had transcended diplomacy to become a cultural phenomenon inspiring artistic expression and intellectual discourse worldwide. International book publishers rushed to translate Traoré's earlier writings, sensing a global hunger for his philosophy of dignified resistance. The symbolic power of the moment resonated far beyond Africa's borders, inspiring marginalized communities worldwide to embrace dignified resistance over reactive anger. Indigenous leaders in the Americas referenced Traoré's response in their own struggles against institutional racism and colonial legacies. Asian civil rights activists adopted his phrase about remaining human, while others behaved like beasts, using it in campaigns against discrimination. The Global South found a new voice in Traoré's words, seeing him as the embodiment of their collective struggle for respect and equality. His response had become a template for how oppressed peoples could reclaim their dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. The incident proved that moral authority could triumph over political power when wielded with wisdom and courage. Youth movements across 6 continents began organizing under the banner of dignified resistance, using Traoré's philosophy as their guiding principle. Universities from S. Paulo to Mumbai announced new courses studying his approach to leadership and conflict resolution. The young Burkina Faso president had unwittingly become a global symbol of how to transform insult into inspiration through sheer force of character. His words were being translated into dozens of languages studied in political science classrooms and quoted in legislative chambers around the world. The zoo comment that was meant to diminish had instead elevated. The decision sent shockwaves through international markets, as other African nations watched to see if this small landlocked country would follow through on its principled stance. Traoré's economic advisors had prepared for this moment, knowing that dignity without action was merely performance. The suspension affected $200 million in annual trade, including critical mineral exports that American tech companies desperately needed. Financial markets in New York trembled as investors realized that Africa's new generation of leaders was willing to sacrifice profit for principle. The bold move demonstrated that Burkina Faso was prepared to put its money where its mouth was, literally. Chinese and Russian trade delegations arrived in Ouagadougou within the week, offering alternative partnerships that came without the cultural humiliation traditionally attached to Western deals. The timing was no coincidence. Both nations had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening to challenge American economic hegemony in Africa. India and Brazil quickly followed suit, proposing South-South cooperation agreements that bypassed traditional Western intermediaries entirely. The African Development Bank announced a special emergency fund to support Burkina Faso's transition away from American economic dependence. Even France, despite its colonial history, began quietly exploring ways to position itself as a more respectful alternative to American partnership. The economic realignment was happening faster than anyone had anticipated, proving that moral authority could indeed translate into tangible financial opportunities. The gold mining sector, Burkina Faso's economic backbone, became the centerpiece of the new independence strategy. Traore announced that all gold exports would now be processed domestically, creating thousands of jobs and keeping value-added profits within the country. The decision to end raw material exports to American refineries was both economically and symbolically powerful, representing Africa's determination to control its own resources. Regional partnerships with Ghana and Mali created a West African gold processing corridor that bypassed traditional Western middlemen entirely. The move sparked similar initiatives across the continent, as other leaders realized they could monetize their dignity rather than compromise it. Within months, what had started as a diplomatic incident had become a blueprint for economic liberation. The ripple effects reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, as other African nations began questioning their own economic subservience to powers that clearly held them in contempt. Nigeria's president announced a review of all trade agreements that failed to include dignity clauses protecting against racist treatment. South Africa's parliament passed a resolution requiring respect for human dignity in all international partnerships, effectively creating a new standard for diplomatic engagement. The incident had accidentally triggered the economic awakening that Pan-African leaders had been trying to achieve for decades. American corporations watched nervously as their access to African markets became contingent on basic human respect. The zoo comment had cost America far more than anyone initially calculated, proving that insults to dignity carried hidden economic consequences. Psychologists and leadership experts worldwide began dissecting Traore's response, marveling at the emotional intelligence required to transform humiliation into moral victory. Harvard Business School's crisis management professor called it a master class in psychological jiu-jitsu, using an opponent's aggression against them. The young leader had demonstrated what ancient African philosophy called Ubuntu, the understanding that one's humanity is affirmed through recognizing the humanity of others even when they fail to reciprocate. His refusal to match Trump's crude behavior had elevated him above the conflict, while simultaneously exposing the moral bankruptcy of his opponent. Child psychologists noted that Traore's response embodied the mature emotional regulation that many adults struggle to achieve under pressure. The incident became a case study in how true strength manifests not through retaliation, but through principled restraint. Leadership minds across the globe began incorporating the Geneva response into their curricula as the gold standard for handling personal attacks in professional settings. The technique of acknowledging an insult while redirecting the conversation to higher principles became known as Traore's pivot in diplomatic circles. Business schools analyzed how his calm demeanor had actually destabilized his opponent more effectively than any aggressive counterattack could have achieved. Military minds studied his strategic patience, recognizing that he had turned a moment of apparent weakness into a position of overwhelming moral strength. The response demonstrated that true leadership meant controlling not just one's actions, but one's reactions under extreme provocation. Executive coaching programs worldwide began teaching the dignified deflection technique as an essential skill for modern leaders. Historical parallels emerged as scholars compared Traore's response to other legendary moments of grace under pressure. The comparison to Nelson Mandela's approach to his oppressors was inevitable, though many noted that Traore's response was more philosophically sophisticated and immediate. Gandhi's philosophy of Satyagraha, truth force, found new expression in the young African leader's unwavering commitment to dignity over defensiveness. Martin Luther King Jr.'s disciples recognized echoes of the civil rights leader's approach to transforming suffering into moral authority. The incident joined the pantheon of moments where individual character had shifted the trajectory of international relations. Unlike many historical examples, this transformation had happened in real time, broadcast to a global audience hungry for authentic leadership. The psychological mastery displayed in those crucial minutes revealed a leader who understood that power ultimately flows from moral authority rather than institutional position. Traore had intuitively grasped that Trump's insult was actually a gift, an opportunity to demonstrate the contrast between crude power and refined leadership. His response had been calculated not for immediate gratification, but for long-term strategic advantage, showing the patience of a chess master playing multiple moves ahead. The incident proved that in an age of instant communication, The leader who controls the narrative controls the outcome. Military strategists noted that he had achieved total victory without firing a single shot, using only the weapons of wisdom and dignity. The lesson was clear. True leadership in the modern world required the ability to transform attacks into opportunities for moral elevation. Within days of the Geneva incident, African leaders faced an unprecedented moment of continental reckoning that would define their political legacies. Kenya's President William R. Publicly. Nigeria's Bola Tinubu, despite his traditionally pro-Western stance, found himself pressured by massive street demonstrations demanding he adopt similar principles of dignified resistance. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa announced a comprehensive review of all diplomatic protocols to ensure African dignity is never compromised in international forums. Even traditionally cautious leaders like Ghana's Nana Akufo-Addo were forced to publicly align with Traore's stance or risk losing credibility with their own populations. The continental solidarity movement was no longer optional. It had become a political necessity for survival. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with emergency sessions as member states crafted a unified response to what they now called the Geneva humiliation. Morocco's King Mohammed VI, despite his kingdom's unique relationship with Western powers, issued a statement supporting the dignity of all African peoples. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed called for a continental charter of diplomatic dignity that would govern future interactions with Western powers. The East African Community announced joint trade initiatives specifically designed to reduce dependence on American markets. Even smaller nations like Rwanda and Botswana, traditionally pragmatic in their international relations, began exploring alternative partnerships that prioritized respect over raw economic benefit. The incident had accidentally created the African unity that decades of formal integration efforts had failed to achieve. Youth movements across the continent transformed Traore's philosophy into a practical blueprint for social and political transformation. Students in Cairo organized dignity marches that spread to universities in Tunis, Casablanca, and Ailers, creating a North African solidarity network. The message reached the streets of Kinshasa, where young Congolese activists adopted Traore's quotes about servant leadership in their protests against corruption. South African students at the University of Cape Town began wearing T-shirts with his most powerful quotes, turning academic spaces into centers of Pan-African consciousness. The movement transcended traditional linguistic and cultural barriers, with French-speaking, English-speaking, Arabic-speaking, and Portuguese-speaking Africans finding common ground in their shared dignity. Youth across the continent finally had a contemporary hero who embodied their aspirations for respect and self-determination. The diplomatic transformation accelerated as traditional power structures crumbled under the weight of popular demand for dignified international relations. Angola's João Lourenço announced new partnership criteria that explicitly included mutual respect clauses in all future agreements. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, voted to establish a dignity protocol that would govern interactions with non-African powers. Even established leaders who had built careers on Western accommodation found themselves adopting Traore's language of principled resistance. The young Burkina President had unknowingly triggered a continental awakening that would reshape Africa's relationship with the world. His response to a single insult had become the catalyst for the most significant shift in African diplomacy since independence. The Geneva incident fundamentally altered the architecture of international diplomacy, creating what scholars would later call the Traore doctrine of dignified resistance. Western powers found themselves forced to recalibrate their approach to African relations. Recognizing that the old colonial playbook had been permanently discredited, the United Nations began incorporating dignity protocols into all multilateral discussions, acknowledging that respect was no longer optional but essential for effective diplomacy. American foreign policy experts scrambled to develop new frameworks that could repair the damage caused by Trump's crude insult and its global repercussions. The incident had proven that in an interconnected world, moral authority could trump military and economic power when wielded with wisdom and courage. Future diplomatic training programs would forever reference the moment when one man's dignity transformed the entire continental relationship with the West. Africa's transformation was visible in every international forum, as leaders carried themselves with a new sense of collective dignity inspired by Traore's example. The continent's negotiating position in trade deals, climate discussions, and security partnerships reflected this philosophical shift toward partnerships based on mutual respect rather than historical subjugation. International development organizations were forced to abandon paternalistic approaches that had characterized Western aid for decades, replacing them with collaborative frameworks that acknowledged African agency and wisdom. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund found themselves restructuring loan programs to eliminate the humiliating conditions that had kept African nations in cycles of dependence. The young president's response had accidentally triggered the decolonization of international institutions that had resisted change for generations. Africa was no longer asking for respect. It was demanding it through principled action and unified purpose. The global impact extended far beyond diplomatic circles, as Traore's philosophy influenced social movements, business practices, and educational curricula worldwide. Universities across 6 continents established dignified leadership programs that studied his approach to conflict resolution and moral authority. Corporate training sessions began incorporating his techniques for handling professional attacks and maintaining ethical standards under pressure. The incident had become a touchstone for anyone seeking to understand how individual character could reshape institutional power dynamics. His words were quoted in parliamentary debates, referenced in judicial decisions, and taught in leadership minds from Harvard to the London School of Economics. The zoo comment that was meant to diminish had instead elevated African philosophy to the global stage, proving that wisdom could emerge from the most unlikely confrontations. History would remember the Geneva incident as the moment when Africa's psychological liberation finally matched its political independence, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Traore's place in the pantheon of transformational leaders was secured not through military conquest or economic achievement, but through the simple power of refusing to be diminished by those who sought to diminish him. The incident demonstrated that true power in the modern world flowed from moral authority rather than institutional position, inspiring a generation of leaders to prioritize dignity over convenience. Future historians would mark this as the turning point when the Global South finally found its voice and the confidence to use it. The power of dignity had triumphed over the politics of degradation, creating a new template for international relations based on mutual respect rather than historical dominance.